You're probably familiar with the famous Archimedes quotation, "The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line." This definitely does not hold for the human digestive tract. This highly convoluted tube begins in the superior abdominal cavity, right around the midline, curves to the right, takes a turn around to the left, then anterior, then it runs to the lower right, then runs superior, to the left, inferior, and finally exits inferior along the midline. It's hard to imagine how it came to rest this way. Additionally, many of the organs are wrapped in a membrane and interconnected with one another, while the other organs are located behind the membrane. Confused yet? Well, don't worry, it's pretty natural to feel this way when first introduced to the abdominal cavity. To really get an idea of what's going on in the relationship of the abdominal organs to one another, we need to go back to embryology and look at the development of this region of the body. By looking at where we started and the steps that get us to where we end up, allows us a better understanding of the organs and why they look the way they do. So to begin our discussion of the abdominal cavity, let me present the embryology of the abdominal cavity. Good day and welcome to the first of 3 videos on the anatomy of the abdominal cavity. In this first video, we're going to look at some of the embryological development associated with the abdominal cavity. Now, this is crucial in gaining an understanding of why organs are located where they are within this cavity. As part of this discussion, we will also introduce you to the peritoneum, a serous membrane that covers the internal surface of the abdominal cavity, as well as many of the organs found within this cavity. In doing so, we'll introduce some terms such as mesentery, omentum, and intraperitoneal versus retroperitoneal organs. We'll start where we left off in our first embryology lecture of the year. If you remember back, we talked about the lateral folding and the formation of the gut tube from the endoderm-lined lateral plate mesoderm. The gut tube itself is divided into 3 principal regions based on the blood supply it receives. The first segment is called the foregut, which extends from the distal portion of what will ultimately become the esophagus through the proximal portion of the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. This region is supplied by arterial branches stemming from the celiac trunk coming off the abdominal aorta. The second division is the midgut. This ultimately forms the longest segment of the intestinal tract, which develops into the jejunum and ileum of the small intestine, as well as the ascending and transverse portions of the large intestine. This region is supplied by branches off the superior mesenteric artery. The last segment of the intestinal tract is called the hindgut. It develops into a descending and sigmoid colon and the proximal portion of the rectum. It is supplied by branches off the inferior mesenteric artery. There are numerous and important arterial branches that come off of each of these 3 arteries. We're not going to run through them here, but you will have the opportunity to identify them in the gross anatomy lab. I'll also post a separate video on which I refer to as a kinesthetic learning exercise, in which I will show you how to draw out the vascular branches to better understand their position. Another concept that is important to understand is that of the peritoneal membrane. This forms from the splanchnic portion of the lateral plate mesoderm, which lies above the gut tube. As the gut tube projects into the embryonic body cavity, the peritoneal membrane is stretched and becomes together as a double membrane, commonly referred to as mesentery, that anchors the gut tube to the posterior wall. The neurovascular supply to the gut tube is also stretched and lies within this double layer of peritoneum. Organs that project forward in this way are called intraperitoneal, being completely enveloped in a layer of serous mesoderm that ultimately forms the visceral peritoneum. This is similar to the visceral pleura that you previously learned about. As we can see in this diagram, the parietal peritoneum lines the inner surface of the abdominal cavity and is continuous with the visceral peritoneum through the dorsal mesentery. Let's take a moment to look at a cross-section through the midgut. Here we can see the developing gut tube projecting into the embryonic cavity, lined with visceral mesoderm and connected to the back wall through the dorsal mesentery. If we then take a moment to look at a cross-section through the foregut, we see a similar sort of arrangement with one key addition. Note that in the foregut we also have a double layer of serous membrane connecting the gut tube to the anterior abdominal wall. This is known as ventral mesentery. The ventral and dorsal mesentery of the foregut play an important role in the formation of accessory abdominal organs that develop in between these folded layers of serous membrane. In the ventral mesentery, the liver begins to develop as a diverticulum, or outpouching, off of the portion of the foregut which will ultimately form the duodenum. This same diverticulum produces the ventral bud of the developing pancreas. A second diverticulum develops off the same region of the foregut, expanding between the layers of the dorsal mesentery, giving rise to the larger dorsal bud of the pancreas. Not shown in this diagram is a collection of lymphatic tissue developing in the dorsal mesentery at the end of an artery stemming from the celiac trunk, which will develop into the spleen. Finally, we notice changes in the gut tube itself as the proximal portion of the foregut expands and will ultimately become the stomach. Once formed, the liver grows rapidly and expands into the right upper quadrant of the abdominal cavity. Looking down at the cavity, this movement causes a 90-degree clockwise rotation of the developing stomach, such that the ventral mesentery shifts to the right side of the abdominal cavity and the dorsal mesentery shifts to the left. Superiorly, a portion of the visceral peritoneum covering the liver fuses with the parietal peritoneum covering the diaphragm. This region of the liver is known as the bare area, since it's not covered in peritoneum. The peritoneal reflection off the diaphragm surrounding the bare area is known as the coronary ligament, due to its resemblance to a crown. Anteriorly, a portion of the ventral mesentery persists as a connection to the liver known as the falciform ligament. The mesenteric connection between the liver and stomach also remains and is now referred to as the lesser omentum. This arrangement creates a pocket dorsal to the lesser omentum known as the lesser sac, with the remainder of the cavity referred to as the greater sac. The two cavities remain in communication through a small hole inferior to the lesser omentum known as the omental foramen or foramen of Winslow. Here we see an anterior view of the lesser omentum, showing its connection to both the liver and foregut. The lesser omentum can be subdivided into the hepatogastric ligament, which is the portion connecting the liver to the stomach, and the hepatoduodenal ligament, connecting the liver to the proximal portion of the small intestine. As we will see in the third segment, the hepatoduodenal ligament envelops the porta hepatis, a collection of 3 vessels supplying blood to the liver and bile secretions from the liver to the small intestine. This is of vital clinical importance as the anterior membrane of the hepatoduodenal ligament is dissected away to expose these vessels during a cholecystectomy or gallbladder removal surgery. The rotation of the gut also has an effect on pancreas development. As the foregut undergoes rotation, the duodenum swings to the right, causing the ventral pancreatic bud, along with its bile duct, to rotate posteriorly into the right, eventually coming to lie just beneath and behind the dorsal bud. This positional change allows the two buds to fuse, forming a single organ with a single pancreatic duct. The ventral bud typically gives rise to the uncinate process and inferior part of the pancreatic head, while the dorsal bud forms the rest of the head, body, and tail of the pancreas. The next developmental concept to discuss is elongation and rotation of the midgut. At around 6 weeks of gestation, the midgut starts to elongate. The abdomen is not large enough to accommodate this lengthening, so the midgut protrudes through the umbilicus, with the proximal portion of the tube lying superior to the distal portion. Elongation slows in the inferior loop, which now starts to increase in diameter, providing a degree of stiffness to this part of the tube that ultimately forms the proximal portion of the large intestine. Elongation continues in the superior portion of the tube, but the stiffness of the inferior loop prevents further herniation. Instead, the superior loop begins to fold in upon itself, resulting in extensive coiling that ultimately forms the jejunum and ileum of the small intestine. At this point, the midgut begins to recede back into the abdominal cavity. And this is done in a highly organized fashion to ensure compact folding of the intestinal tissue, similar to the way we fold clothes before packing a suitcase to make sure that everything fits properly. To accomplish this feat, the superior and inferior loops twist around each other in a counterclockwise direction as the intestinal tract recedes. By completion, the tract will have rotated a total of 270 degrees. The inferior loop comes to rest along the right and superior boundaries of the abdominal cavity, forming the ascending and transverse colon. The coils of the superior loop take a more central position in the abdominal cavity. Similar to the inferior loop of the herniated midgut, the hindgut also grows in diameter, but in this case remains in the abdominal cavity for the duration of development. As the midgut recedes back through the umbilicus, the hindgut is pushed to the left and ultimately occupies the left and inferior boundaries of the cavity, forming the descending and sigmoid colon. The recession of the growing midgut has additional consequences for other organs in the abdominal cavity. First, the recession compresses the foregut against the posterior abdominal wall. When combined with the rotation and lateral expansion of the body wall, the pancreas and duodenum move from an intraperitoneal position to a retroperitoneal position. With retroperitoneal organs, the anterior surface is covered with parietal peritoneum, while the posterior surface is in direct contact with the posterior abdominal wall, with no peritoneal separation. A similar phenomenon is observed with the ascending and descending colon. In this case, recession of the midgut compresses these regions of the large intestine against the posterolateral abdominal wall. Over time, the visceral and parietal peritoneal layers fuse together and are eventually reabsorbed, making the ascending and descending colon secondarily retroperitoneal. Note that the transverse colon is not compressed against the posterior wall and remains intraperitoneal, connected to the posterior wall through the transverse mesocolon. In the sagittal section, we also see the mesenteric connection of the stomach to the posterior abdominal wall. We can also see that the various movements and rotations of the gut tube result in a folding of this double membrane. This creates an apron-like structure in the anterior abdominal wall called the greater omentum. As development continues, the four layers merge together to form a single fused layer. At the same time, the mesenteric stem fuses into the transverse mesocolon. This provides us with an understanding of the fully developed arrangement of the abdominal organs, as well as the peritoneal reflections that hold them in place. That's going to do it for our discussion of the embryological development of the abdominal cavity and the orientation of the peritoneal reflections. In the next section, we will take a closer look at the anatomy of the alimentary canal, which is the canal through which food passes, is digested, and absorbed. We'll see you then.